This is about a larger systemic change about the kind of system we operate in.
I believe that this is the moment that we need democracy more than ever.
We need more people of all types of backgrounds to step up and offer their expertise to solve the challenges in each of our communities.
Let's do what we know to be the right thing and be true to that inner voice. I didn't ask to be treated differently, but I'm going to take it on because I have a job to do and nothing's going to get in my way of doing that.
Go get yourself a political home. You know, Vote or Lead would love to be that home. Black Voters Matter would love to be that home for you.
Thank you for your support. Thank you for leading and running as you are. And I have your back.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And yes, thank you for centering this space. I am State Representative Leslie Herod, but close enough. I think I have to start getting used to Herod because that has been something that has been my name since I was born as well. But
my apologies, my apologies.
It's okay. Yeah, and I'm really glad to be here. Welcome to my home in Denver, Colorado. Things are different these days for all of us, but I am proud to be from Denver. And as I do remind folks, yes, there are Black people in Denver. We are not a cow town, and we're actually a city, quite large city, but you guys all know that now. But I always get some surprises there. But I'm proud to have been elected here in this seat. And as I'm sure a lot of folks have thought about when you're thinking about running for office, I didn't think there was going to be a seat for me in Colorado. I have the same notions that as an African-American queer female, that there was not a place for me in elected office. There wasn't one before, right? And I definitely wasn't going to go back into the closet because I got to tell you, there's way too many photos of me at gay bars for me to say that at Pride, to say that I was, to go back in the closet and pretend to be somebody I'm not. But what I've learned since being elected is that being myself has been my strongest asset. Being who I am, my history is not something that I've, won office despite. I've won it because of, and I'm just so proud to be able to hold this position and to do the work for the community that the community has demanded of me and, wanted in an elected official. So I will give a shout out to my good friend Tashara Jones as well, who I know has been very active in Vote, Run, Lead. It was her mentorship, her idea, and her leadership that spurred me to run the bill for the college Kickstarter program right here in the state of Colorado. And so I actually saw it on a tweet of hers, and I called it. I was like, what is this program? What does it do? What's going on? Tell me more. I was like, all right, I'm doing it. And so it's just so great to have those types of networks of women so that we can do the work and do it as good as we need to, right? Do it great. Also, I think in the opening, when we set the conversation for me, it was interesting because I think when we have these conversations about when we feel safe, that there also should be an acknowledgement, which I know, Vanessa, you've done, that it's harder for women of color and queer women, right, to think of that truly safe time. It's just not as frequent. And as was mentioned, when the few times you're in a room full of Black women who celebrate you, that is a time you think of, and it's so not often, you know what I mean? And I think that while I think as Black women and Black queer women, we have felt a bit alone in that and how hard it is for us to feel safe. I think right now, people are feeling that more across the board. People are feeling unsafe across the board. They're feeling uncomfortable across the board. And let me tell you, that is not a bad thing. It's a good thing to get a little bit uncomfortable. And if we're not uncomfortable right now in the middle of a global pandemic and a call for racial equality, then we're not awake, right? So let's keep being uncomfortable. So that leads me to the talk on police reform and reform for law enforcement. So I had to center this in saying something that a lot of folks don't realize, but my father, who raised me, is a law enforcement officer retired. He was actually the head of internal investigations for a Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, which is a federal penitentiary. He started as a groundskeeper and worked his way up. And in Southern Colorado, there are not many other jobs outside of the prison industrial complex. And so, in talking to my father, talking to law enforcement officers for years, I also did the Harvard Kennedy School, which if any of you have the ability to do that, do it. It's typically offered to activists, electeds, and folks in different sectors on an annual basis, speaking to law enforcement officers there, we kept going back to the same issue, which was there have been police reform that has been done. Folks are very upset about it, always. But it hasn't necessarily stopped the murder of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and low-income people by law enforcement officers. It has not created any more safe environment for people who look like me to be out in the community and have interaction with law enforcement. And it's definitely not created a situation where we are no longer having to talk to our young children, Black and brown boys and girls, and folks living outside of the gender binary about what to do when you interact with a law enforcement officer, and how important it is not to call the police unless it's super necessary because someone could end up dead. So there's so much more work that we needed to do. And in this wake of the George Floyd murder, and then the call for justice for Elijah McClain, I had a unique opportunity to run a pretty comprehensive law enforcement accountability bill. That was not a lot of shalls and pleases, but more a lot of must and wills, which I think is really important. And so initially, in the beginning of 2020, I was actually working on a bill that was much more narrow and really related to what happened with Elijah McClain, the lack of access to body camera footage, the chokehold that was initially used on Elijah McClain, and then also what happened to Devon Bailey in Colorado, who was shot in the back while running away from police. And folks, you know, we all have our stories where we can center our law enforcement work on. It's not only about George Floyd, it's also about all of the issues that have happened in all of our communities, big or small, right? And just the lack of accountability and the lack of justice for families who have been harmed by police brutality. And so I wanted to create this bill that really addressed those two specific issues. And I was told that because of COVID, I could not introduce the bill because it wasn't important enough, to be honest with you, to override the COVID concerns, I guess, the focus on COVID, but also that it was too controversial, right? Well, as you might, as I think was interesting is that once we actually took a break because of COVID, we actually came back from that break and we were during the week of the protests starting. So we had a couple of days under our belt and then the protest started right out in front of the Colorado State Capitol. And in that first protest, I was actually shot at. There was 8 shots that were shot into the building, into the crowd of peaceful protesters. And it was definitely by someone who's an agitator. And as we know, as the scenes have played out more recently, that those people do exist. And there was a very specific intent to create these agitators. Well, in that moment, I got a call from my caucus and it was, you know, after I got rushed in, a Capitol lockdown, all those things. It was, what can we do to help you? We're so sorry, we're, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, thank you, I appreciate it. And I think as a Black woman, I wasn't probably as shook as some other folks who have not been in certain situations before. But I said, I don't really want your niceties. I don't want your bath bombs, although I do like bath bombs. I want a bill. I'm a legislator now, and I can do something about it. And I want a bill, and I want you all to sign on to it. And I will tell you, the speaker and the majority leader were very upset with me that I brought that up in that conversation. But eventually, every single caucus, yes, the Democratic caucus, every single member of the House Democrats signed on to the bill. And before it was introduced, which was in days, every single Democratic member of the Senate caucus was on the bill, including my good friend, Senator Faith Winters. And so this is what the bill does. The Senate Bill 217 mandates the use of body cameras throughout Colorado for any law enforcement officer, period. Everyone has to have body cameras, okay? That is by 2023. Additionally, which is really important, and I think as you guys work on these bills, speaking to civil rights attorneys who are doing the work is gonna be key. But additionally, that body camera footage has to be released unedited unless there's certain privacy concerns, very narrow window, within 21 days and 45 days if it's under investigation. Because law enforcement has a tendency to wait out issues, right? Wait out the response from the community. So that when the body camera footage is released, the community has started either working on something else or has lost focus, right? That's their hope. So we put a very close, very short window on that. We also mandated reporting on policing that we've not had before. Racial profiling data, required now. Every time you unholster a weapon, required now. Every time you even, definitely point a weapon at someone else, but pull someone over for seizure and then let them go, required reporting. Because we need to have the data so that we can track what's going on and intervene. On top of that data reporting, we actually allowed the AG for the state of Colorado to step in and do patterns and practice investigations when they see issues with the data, which is very important. We also reined in the use of deadly force by outlawing any type of chokehold or carotid holds, by removing fleeing felon off of our books in Colorado once and for all, and by narrowing when force can be used to when you are in a harmful situation. And when you're pursuing someone who has committed a felony, right? So this whole murdering of someone because they were selling cigarettes on the streets, right? Or because they had maybe suspected of a counterfeit $20 bill is no longer a defense in Colorado, which is really important because we also saw what happened to those young babies out in Aurora just this week, where they were stopped and pulled over, thrown out of their cars, thrown on the ground, simply because allegedly the officers thought the car was stolen. They were driving an SUV. The car they were looking for was a motorcycle. And it was a horrific and traumatic experience. Those officers should be prosecuted. Additionally, we ended qualified immunity, which I know you guys are hearing a lot about. We created a small window for qualified immunity, basically saying that we banned it. It's no longer a defense. Cities can indemnify and should indemnify their officers, but if a person acts in bad faith, they will have the requirement of paying up to $25,000 or 5% of that entire settlement from their own pockets. Now, my brother's a doctor. We know that folks eventually will insure themselves. That's what we want. Actually, we want the private market to come in and say who's insurable and who's not, provide more rigorous psychological evaluations, provide more rigorous background checks, and ensure that there is a re-up period for recertifying folks. That is very important because that's what I have to do as a driver's license, as my brother has to do as a doctor. It is something that actually, quite frankly, works and is a part of Black political theory for a very long time, is that we need law enforcement officers to be insured. We're creating a situation to allow that. We're not requiring insurance though, but we're creating the environment for that to come. And there's already been people who have products now who are offering them up. We also are defending Colorado communities, which we think is really obviously important. So this is the racial profiling data, the body camera footage, and then also the protecting protesters, where you have to actually give a clear announcement that you're going to be using some type of tear gas or whatnot, and that folks have time to disperse, and that you're not basically locking people, trapping people into an alley or into a corner and then shooting tear gas at them. We've seen that happen in the protests that have been going on now. That amendment was added into the bill by Senator Julie Gonzalez, and it's a really strong protection. And so that is what the bill does at large, but there's so much more work that we need to do. And so when we talk about, I think next slide, when we talk about looking into the future and about law enforcement, we really have to make sure that we are ensuring that all investigations for excessive use of force is independent. So making sure that every state has some type of independent oversight. And so that, I think, is a third bullet, further increasing accountability and oversight of law enforcement. And we also have to talk about divesting from law enforcement, right? And investing in education. So folks are very concerned about the language around defund and divest and divesting in policing. Fine, I don't care what you want to call it, but we actually can save lives and strengthen our communities when we invest in education and in mental health support. So in Colorado, Denver, I passed a bill, ballot measure called Caring for Denver. It asks for a 25 cents on a $100 sales tax increase to provide about $35 million worth of mental health and substance use services right here in Denver. We're using that fund now to create a model similar to what's going on in Eugene, Oregon, called Cahoots. We're calling it the STAR model, where now if someone calls 911, and it's already been put into place since June, if someone calls 911 and you live in the piloted area, you will actually get a mental health support professional and an EMT and not law enforcement. And I'm proud to say that that program, STAR, has been working very well with our law enforcement agencies, and that they have not yet had to call the police on any of their calls yet at all. Additionally, law enforcement has been utilizing them more for their calls because they feel like it might be inappropriate or they might have a worse outcome, which they're probably right, if STAR goes on scene as opposed to law enforcement first. And then we must also refocus the purpose and the role of law enforcement. I can't tell you how many officers I've spoken to who have said that they didn't know they were getting into a mental health role. They didn't know that that's what they were doing, and they are. And so we have to either rethink what law enforcement is or ensure that those officers are actually in the job that we need in the community, right? Because too often they're not. So the interesting thing is, and yes, I'm happy to move into questions just now. One thing I want to note is that I've had really good success in working with good chiefs from across the country on these issues. Chiefs of police tend to get it. They tend to understand that they need more training, for instance, in crisis intervention, or that they want qualified immunity quietly. They won't tell you out loud in public, because they can't get bad officers off their force because of the unions, right? So they tell you all of these different things. They want to, the other piece of the bill is that we remove their post-certification if they have excessive use of force. So they no longer can be law enforcement officers in the state ever again, anywhere, not just in the department that they were removed from. And it'll be put in a public database so you can all see it. But they say they want that because they've had so much trouble doing that as chiefs themselves, especially major city chiefs. So I've had really good conversations with them. The thing we have to be careful about is not just putting more money into the system, but really looking at budget neutral or budget negative solutions that actually move money to where it needs to go and ensures that our communities are more safe and the resources are built up in our communities, which we know we need because it's COVID time. And the conversation about the only budget that shouldn't be cut is law enforcement is wrong. We can't cut human services, we can't cut education, we can't cut healthcare and then not cut policing and then expect our communities to be whole and to be sufficient. That's just not going to happen. And so it's been a really great journey. It's been amazing. I'm so honored and sometimes extremely shocked by the amount of support that we've gotten in Colorado for the work that we've done. And I'm shocked also by the amount of support I've gotten from even my colleagues who I know are well-meaning, but maybe don't want to step out that far. It has truly been a team effort, and I'm so honored to be able to serve here in Colorado and speak to you all nationally about these issues. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Right, that was amazing. If you do have, we see that we have a number of questions in the chat. If you have any additional questions, or if you do want to ask Representative Leslie, how do you pronounce your last name again? Herod.
Yep.
Representative Leslie Herod, any questions, please put it in the chat and we will get to a few in a sec. Erin, are we asking questions right now?
Yeah, I think so. I think there was a lot there, so I want any qualifying questions that folks might have. I have a little bit of a moderator's privilege I want to take, and you talked about how you used this moment where that sort of no niceties, I want to pass a bill. But what were some of the other behind the scenes conversations? So you said civil rights attorneys, you said chiefs of police, your colleagues. What were some of the other, just that other, like, that stuff we don't see and hear in getting and building this coalition to pass this bill? I'm curious about some of the pushback and how you navigated that.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because I think that a lot of these conversations had happened for so long that it was hard to say that we didn't need mandates at this point. And so really understanding the background of, when Colorado first attempted to have body camera legislation and how that was optional and how folks just aren't doing it, things like that were really important. But it was really important for me to work with the protesters. And as a protester myself, being out there and really hearing what was going on and what people were demanding, and then asking them to engage in a way that was really concrete. Call, email, text your legislator. I'm talking thousands of emails came in from every part of the state. Grand Junction, like rural Colorado, was stepping in and saying, we need this bill. Shocking. We only ended up having 2 no votes total in the Senate by the end of the day, which was huge. It was not a Democrat-only bill. And having conversations behind the scenes with Republicans, including former law enforcement on both the Democratic or the Senate side and the House side was essential. So that was really important. Faith, do you want to add anything as being a part of the fight?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you could touch base quickly on the package that we had done earlier that we called Rebuilding Trust with the Community in, what was that, 2014, and how that hadn't created the change we needed to see, right? And so we did a lot of work in 2014 after Ferguson, and it wasn't working, which is led us to the mandates, because I think that's an important history of how we got such a bold bill.
That is so important, Faith. Thank you, because so many states did something, right, after what happened in Ferguson, and we just didn't see the change. And I got to tell you, to answer our earlier question too, folks were pissed, and folks didn't think it was going to work because they've heard about reform before and nothing's happened, which is why folks are not talking about reform in the same way anymore. But to be honest, there were also legislators who were part of that initial package who were resistant too. Like, we already did that. We already did this, and and maybe didn't want to admit that the shortcomings of the compromises that were made. But really, that was a stepping stone. You know, it wasn't that those policies were failed, because if we didn't have them as a groundwork, we wouldn't have been able to say, no, we're not going to compromise there, because that was already on the books, right? The compromise was already on the books and it wasn't working. And so it was, working as well as it should be. And so we needed to build on that. And so it is important to know the history of reform before you kind of go into it, the history of whatever you're working on, because you'll hurt someone's feelings and not mean to. And sometimes in the legislature, hurt feelings means no votes, to be honest, right? And so you just have to kind of work through that and make sure you're working within the right frame. But police reform is not over in one bill. It's not over in one package. It's not over in 1 year. Why would we think police reform would be any different than any other area? Environmental reform, business growth, any of that stuff that we work on every single year. We should work on this every single year too. We have to keep evolving so that we can ensure that those who are sworn to serve and protect us actually do. Right.
One of the things, I think there's wide agreement in our community around mental health services, and the things that cops are being called out to do are not the things that cops are qualified to do. But how did you have conversations, when people might have said things like, hey, how does the cop know this person has mental illness? Or, what was some of that negotiation and conversation that you were having?
Yeah, so the mental illness side is separate. So that's happened really with working directly with DPD, my Denver Police Department, a lot. And even traveling with the chief to go visit these programs before he was chief and he was commander, which is interesting how that worked out. But 911 dispatchers know. Lean on 911. They know these calls. They know how to parse out. They know what is needed. And the majority of the calls are mental health calls, period. They just, in cities like mine, they are, And so you have to trust and lean on your 911 support and bring them in. I'm sorry, but vans that just ride along separately are not as useful as something that's truly integrated into 911. Because if I'm a mom, and my child is having a mental health break, or my child is maybe even using force against me, got a little bigger than I anticipated by the time he was 14 or something. That's like my brother. That they call 911. You don't look up some other number and wait days for someone to show up in a van. You call 911, and you need to make sure that the right person is dispatched. There should not be a separate number for it. There should not be a separate action. It should be built into the city, and it should be a response from the city, because that's what we need. And I'm happy to talk a lot more about Cahoots or a lot more about STAR with anyone who wants to talk about it, because it is working in Colorado, it is working in Denver, and we have to spread this model across the country.